Now live.
Okay, welcome to our webinar on planning for climate change and resilient infrastructure. I'm Jill Sterrett. I'm a fellow of the American Institute of Certified Planners, and I'm a faculty member at the University of Washington, based in Seattle. This webinar is provided by the Infrastructure Planning and Management Program at the University of Washington. This is a 2-year master's degree program which incorporates planning and emergency management principles and examines the interrelationships of 6 different types of infrastructure. We look at energy, transportation, water, communications, food systems, and public health. We are offering this webinar to our students and alumni of the program and faculty of the program. We will also make it available to members of the American Planning Association for their certification maintenance credits. If you were interested to find out more about the degree program, stay on the line at the end of our presentation, and we'll take a few minutes to tell you more about that. But you should see, I didn't tell you to forward, on the screen, some information. Can you forward the screen?
Oh, sure.
And we'll get that up. There we go. This is our master's program, and if you'd like more information, there is the website for that and a contact who's Karen Fisher. This webinar will learn how climate change is influencing the ways we rebuild our aging infrastructure. We have 2 excellent panelists today who are expert in this field, and I'd like to introduce them. Next slide will give us some of that information. Our first speaker is Steve Moddemeyer. Steve leads the planning and sustainability practice for CollinsWoerman, an architecture and planning firm based in Seattle. He has more than 23 years of experience leading governments, landowners, and project teams toward increased sustainability. He specializes in creating tools and policies that lead to resilient infrastructure systems. He has extensive experience with complex public and private development issues and the development of sustainable strategies for major capital improvement projects. His recent work includes developing resilience performance standards for the infrastructure of Boulder County, Colorado, preparing Seattle's pre-disaster recovery plan, co-authoring a benefit cost analysis on policies to address seismic risk from unreinforced masonry buildings, and working with the National Academy of Sciences Resilient America pilot project in Seattle. Our second speaker is Rhys Roth. Rhys co-founded and helped lead for over 15 years the nonprofit group Climate Solutions. He pioneered several of its innovative programs and partnerships that were instrumental in positioning clean energy at the top of the Northwest economic development agenda. Late in 2013, he returned to his alma mater, the Evergreen State College, to lead the college's new Center for Sustainable Infrastructure. This group helps released in November of 2014. And he also has a new report, Rewiring the Northwest Energy System, just released past February of this year. Both of these documents are available online, and we'll provide the links to those a little bit later on the site. Steve is going to start us off today.
Thanks, Jill. Rhys, and hello, everyone. As Jill said, I'm Steve Moddemeyer, Principal at CollinsWoerman, a planning and architecture firm in Seattle. And I'm going to talk about how climate change impacts infrastructure, which is a big topic, but I'm going to kind of pick a little bit of a focus on it as we move through. So the key slide is that we're really in a time of extreme uncertainty now, and as planners, we're used to helping guide communities through change. That's a lot of what we're doing. We're anticipating job growth or environmental protection, population growth. We're trying to accommodate all those things. So we're used to guiding communities through change. But what happened with climate change is it's actually, we've just shifted into a whole new regime that I'm going to talk about a little bit. And so climate change isn't just one more thing that adds into how we think about infrastructure in our cities. It actually changes almost everything in a way that I want to talk about. And when I say almost everything on the infrastructure front, I mean the roads, how we design our roads, how we and maintain them, how we design and maintain our bridges, our shorelines, our water supply, both up in the mountains and also the supply lines, our wastewater systems, how we treat as well as how we collect, stormwater systems, energy systems, land use, all of that stuff is going to be impacted by this extreme uncertainty. What happened was in 2009, there was a report by Milley et al. That said that stationarity is dead. And to most of us, stationarity means what? Oh, okay, it's dead. Well, what happened was, up until 2009, we have been planning our urban infrastructure system and actually our river and all water resources management with the idea that there's variability in the climate, but it's stable. And this variability, you know, we kind of basically have highs and lows around a stable mean or stable center. And that was generally good advice for the last 13,000 plus years because we've been in pretty much a very stable climate regime. But what happened in 2009 was that the scientists, water resources scientists said, there's now so much more thermal energy in the atmosphere from greenhouse gases trapping that heat. That thermal energy in the atmosphere and the fact that a warmer air holds more water moisture, that those two things together are actually driving us out of anything that we've experienced before. So we now not only have the normal variability we expected, but in the sense the climate of the future is decoupled from the last 100 years of weather record. The way that we design our infrastructure systems is based on that weather record. And so since 2009, we've been continuing to build all of our infrastructure as if the climate of the future was going to be like the climate of the past. But what Milley and all are saying is that's not the case. So what does that mean for us and what do we need to do? And what it means is that we have this extreme uncertainty that I mentioned. Because the way that we calculate risk is the probability of an extreme event times the consequences of the event. So if there's a 10% chance we'll have something that costs $1 million to fix, 10 times a million, there's a $10 million risk. And we should be willing to spend $10 million to negate that risk. And if we can negate that risk for $5 million, then that's a really good investment. But what's happened now is that the calculation of risk is now not possible to do because we don't know what the probability of any extreme event is going to be. Yet we still use risk to design all of our infrastructure systems. So that's the problem that needs to be fixed. Now, one of the issues is that folks go, well, if I can't use probability to design my system, how do I know how big or small to make it? Because that's how we could determine what sort of flows need to go under the bridge or under the road. You know, what kind of extreme events we're going to have, how often things will break. And so dealing with that is why more and more of my practice working with communities is around understanding resilience, because the science of ecological resilience, socio-ecological resilience, is a really powerful framework for understanding how communities and ecosystems can adapt to change over time. So let's briefly look at some of the principles of resilience. This little really graphic that I just love. It's a Fritz Holling first developed it, and this is called the adaptive cycle. And basically what it shows is that, we need to go back up one, I think, unless, I guess we can't.
Oh, here we go.
And I see it's not happening anyway. So well, let me use it for example. In this, the bottom up front of that graphic, it says exploit. Imagine if you had an old-growth forest, but there was a small fire, and let's say 10 acres of the forest floor was exposed to the sunlight. Meanwhile, there's old-growth forest around it. Between the rain and the sun and the soil, that 10 acres would start growing, and it would then contribute to the old-growth forest. So as you go through this phase of, and hopefully there's a slide now that shows this kind of front arch, once you go through that phase, then that front phase, that's the part where a system gets more and more resilient. It's able to withstand change and be very stable. But to really be resilient over the thousands of years, whether it's an ecosystem or even a city, it also has to be able, if it gets broken, to recover quickly. And that's the next slide, where a system, instead of continuing on forever to get better and better, a system that's truly resilient will break. It will go through that release phase where it loses resources, and then if it's resilient, it will reorganize quickly. This cycle, going around and around and around, is what resilient systems in nature do, and it's also what cities do. You think about cities, they outlast the nations that claim them. Cities go through wars, and they go through pandemics, and they go through earthquakes, and they figure out how to come back, how to go through that loss stage, and how to reorganize and maintain their identity. So that's the essence of resilience. We need to use the lessons from resilience and apply it to the way we design infrastructure, and that then gives us the capacity to adapt to change. And that's really the bottom line. We need to increase our capacity to adapt to an uncertain future. So the next slide is I want to just briefly talk about this project we just finished in Colorado, a case study. And we implemented for the Boulder County, City of Boulder, City of Longmont, and Louisville, several cities and communities in Boulder County area. We helped develop for them a resilient design performance standard for their infrastructure and buildings. Resilient design performance standard. And I'm going to briefly describe how we did that. One of the things the reason that they did that was that back in 2012, they had a drought, which then caused areas to burn up in the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. Those burned areas then in 2013 suffered extreme, unprecedented rainfall events that mobilized all that bare soil, which then filled in the stream channels, and then on top of it was this huge amount of water that it hadn't been seen for hundreds, if not 1,000 years or more. And then these floods just roared out of the North Range into the Boulder County communities and did more than $1 billion of damage. They were able to receive federal funding from HUD, the Community Development Block Grants for disaster recovery, and so they've been getting those resources. Well, HUD has this little rule in the Federal Register that says you need to use resilient design performance standards if you're going to apply this money. And that's because HUD wants to be sure that we build back better rather than just build back what broke last time and have it break again. So the communities in Boulder County said, you know, we don't have a resilient design performance standard, so we need one. So I was lucky to hire our firm, and then we partnered with Chris Poland, who's a NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technologies. He's a NIST Resilience Fellow. And we then worked with the Boulder County communities to implement the NIST process, which is called the NIST Guide to Community Resilience. And then we also applied. So I'll briefly describe what happened there. So there were 4 key issues. We set performance goals for infrastructure, and I'll explain how important that was and how NIST guided us. Second, we then added the principles of resilience and sustainability based on that Holland model of the adaptive cycle. We then created those principles together to guide how the projects get designed. And then we developed a way for them to develop alternatives that explored that and how to report it. So this next slide should say the level 1 performance goals. This is what the NIST process did that was really important. It says instead of thinking about the 100-year flood, which we know from Millie you can't calculate anymore. So instead of thinking about how long is it okay for something to be broken. Like if you have a regional hospital, how long can it be shut down in an emergency before you need it up and running? Well, you might say, I don't want it to ever shut down, or maybe 1 day at the most. Okay, what about the infrastructure that supports that hospital? The roads that come in, if they are broken for 2 weeks, your hospital may be able to get people brought in by helicopters, but what about your staff? And what about those supplies that you need? So the roads that support that hospital become more important than other roads in the county that serve parts of the community that maybe could be broken for longer. So we went through, if you look at the next slide here, you'll see that there's this chart we went through. There's about 150 of these aspects of the community buildings and infrastructure that supports them, whether it's water, energy, wastewater, et cetera. And we went through as a group of the communities and we said, how long is it okay for each of these to be broken? What do we think is a reasonable performance target for this infrastructure? And then we used that target to be the goals for the community. One of the beauties of this approach is that it helps you identify what are priorities. It frees you from using the old risk reliability model, which is, we know is broken. And it helps you identify which parts need to come first and what are the interdependencies between infrastructure and the things that we value or need to be most functional. This can all be done while we're in the heyday of the community growing and doing well. If we think that way, then we'll start improving our infrastructure to get this level of performance that we set at this goal sector. Just a couple more steps, then I'll wrap this part up. Next we said, okay, now, if you were to just take the NIST guidelines, then you might say, we're going to harden everything. We don't know how strong, how high to make the bridge, but we know that it has to have performance. That means it'll be back in order. The future is uncertain because of this loss of stationarity. So what we help them do is develop this checklist that guides project teams to identify alternatives that do a better job at dealing with a range of possible futures. So if you look at this next slide, you should see a couple of circles of typical Venn diagram. One is resilience practices and the other is sustainability practices. And what we look for is where do they overlap, where do they reinforce each other? And then that became the guidance for this checklist that now project teams use for these projects as they develop them. The third step was really then develop broad alternatives that are integrated across the silos, that do a better job of handling a range of future conditions. And then if you look at the next slide, it will show you just a snapshot of the first page of the checklist. It's got 24 items in it, so this is a dozen or so on this page. I know you can't read it, but the upshot here is that this checklist is a little bit like a lead checklist, where you go through and then you can optionally do one of these points, but you have to at least get 80% of them. And so that becomes a threshold for the work that you do as you're designing the project. And it's now being implemented in Boulder County communities, and we're continuing to work with them to refine some of the details to make sure it works. And then the final then need to document it in a business case. And as the environment. And one last point is just that one of the keys to resilience is that it's not just the infrastructure, it's the community itself and the culture of the community. And so these resilience and sustainability principles that we wove together are very much about building the capacity of the community to solve problems among themselves, as well as build infrastructure that supports their capacity to survive these kind of unusual events that will be coming in the future. So that's it for now, but I'll hand it back over to, I think,
do I need to do anything for?
No, we're good. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, and starting the Center for Sustainable Infrastructure, I sat down and formally interviewed 70 thought leaders and innovators from Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia to really drink in their perspective and wisdom about the future of infrastructure, recognizing that we spend billions and billions of dollars on our transportation systems, our energy systems, resilient, affordable, and beneficial outcomes. That was kind of the design question. And so some principles emerged from those conversations that I want to run through quickly. One, go for the triple let's look for opportunities that give us excellent environmental performance, really enhance resilience of our systems, and are affordable on the life cycle. These projects, which are typically multi-decade projects. So when we're making these investment decisions, they're long-term investments. They'll be with the community for a long time. People will be paying for them for a long time. So it really and they will deliver other community-wide benefits in terms of public health, in terms of environmental systems and sustainability, in terms of the local economy. So those are the kind of solutions. One example I think is really great is that the Clean Water Services, which serves Hillsboro, Oregon, and surrounding communities, they were faced with having to build a chiller because their outflow pipe at their wastewater treatment plant pouring in the Tualatin River was pouring water that was too warm for the fish. And so regulatory agency was cracking down, you need to cool that water off. That was going to cost, the chiller machine was going to cost about $100 million life cycle. Instead, they chose another alternative, which was to restore streamside habitat over 50 miles upstream of the wastewater treatment plant, which brought investment that benefited local landowners, enhanced their property. It brought habitat benefits. It brought resilience benefits because you have better streamside riparian habitat, which can control flooding. It reduced the greenhouse gas emissions that would have happened with the chiller, and it came in at about 1/10 of the cost of the mechanical solution. So just an example of how sometimes these elegant solutions can knit together. Next principle, encourage silo busting. Steve talked about these systems interact, but institutionally we tend to manage them in separate silos where you have separate budgets, separate management, separate directives, separate staff, and it's really hard for those separate utilities and agencies to look for solutions that benefit not only their silo, but also other systems, and identify those solutions that really make sense for multiple systems and allow the systems to work together effectively. One example might be when we dig up the streets, maybe the cable company or we have sewer pipes, we have water pipes, maybe we have electricity, we have cable, we have all sorts of infrastructure underneath the street, and then we have transportation infrastructure on. Following year, if somehow these agencies were coordinating their strategies, we might open up the street once, get all kinds of work done, close up the street, prevent disruption from happening year after year, and save a lot of money for everybody. Okay, next principle, build a better business case. And Steve, I really think that Seattle Public Utilities is the gold standard for this right now in our region. And I think Steve Moddemeyer has deserved a lot of credit for sort of institutionalizing that while he was at the city.
I was there.
You were there. Well, you're part of the team.
Guilt by association.
But when the civil engineers come to Seattle Public Utilities management says we need this piece of infrastructure, we need this capital investment this year. It goes to the economists, and the economists say that could definitely be the right response. Pumping station here could be the right response. But they convene an interdepartmental, interdisciplinary team to look at, really try to understand and identify the problem trying to be addressed, and then look creatively at different alternative ways that problem could be solved. And then with the 3 or 4 favorites that pop out of that, both to the department and also to the community as a whole, and to city government as a whole, and look at it in the near term and over decades. And with all that information that comes out of that analysis, decision makers can make decisions. And they're saving millions and millions and millions of dollars because of this investment discipline. So building a better business cases. World, again, these infrastructure investments are multi-decadal. They're going to be around in 2020, 2030, 2040, 2050, when our kids are grown-ups and they're paying taxes and they're paying their utility rates and they're paying off the investments that we're making now. And so really we have to become future casters as infrastructure planners and investors and really try to understand the world that they're going to be living in. How is climate change going to affect our community? What's the potential for mega earthquakes? What are the demographic changes? Are kids going to be, or is the next generation going to be as interested in the automobile as I was when I was in high school? Maybe they're more interested in getting around on transit or in driverless vehicle, or technology is changing extremely rapidly. We have to start to take those kind of phenomenon into account and really make our investments with the future in mind. Next, Get Smart. Again, we're packing. He was the leading edge then, but it was all in his shoe.
Some of our audience may not remember Get Smart.
That's right. But it's got to be online, right?
That's true.
Yeah. Punching Get Smart. Yeah, it's great. But cutting edge spy, and he had the best technology. But now everybody's walking around with the same technology, where they can do extraordinary, amazing things in terms of information technology, sensors, communication, monitoring, and that's revolutionizing all kinds of industries, and it's beginning to come into our infrastructure systems, opening up all kinds of potential for greater performance, cost savings, greater resilience of our systems, and we need to be able to start to bring those kind of technologies into our infrastructure systems intelligently. One more principle, and that's build community prosperity. Brookings Institute 2014 study found over 10% of the jobs in the entire national economy are infrastructure jobs. Infrastructure is really a pillar of our economy. It's vitally important for business and real estate investment in our community. It's a big affecting every one of the infrastructure sectors. We're going to need to attract and inspire a new generation of infrastructure professionals at all levels of our infrastructure agencies. So building a more diverse infrastructure workforce is important, teaming up with apprenticeship programs and community colleges to bring in this next generation of infrastructure workers and managers. The MIPM program, training a new generation of infrastructure decision makers in the new investment discipline for infrastructure that is sustainable, resilient, and affordable. All kinds of opportunity in the threat that is the Great Retirement Wave, and all kinds of opportunity in the billions of dollars that we need to spend every year on our infrastructure systems to keep our economy and society working. We need to get smarter about it. We need to do it in ways that can really enhance the economy of our communities, and sort of dovetailing the economic development strategies of our communities with our infrastructure strategies can help us get smarter about that.
Rhys, something that you said that I think is really important. When you think about planners, they're often conveners. They bring people with lots of discipline backgrounds together to plan out an area or a location, whether it's the infrastructure or the land use or whatever. And that in that convening role, I think planners have the potential to implement these kinds of concepts that you're talking about, that I'm talking about, to pose the questions to the teams that they assemble to say, how well are we doing with the uncertainty from climate change? And how well are we doing integrating the silos? How well are we doing making sure that this investment also builds the community's capacity and economics? So I think really planners have an outsized role, bigger than they even perhaps tend to realize, to shape the kinds of questions that get asked. Because if you ask the right question, you'll get better answers. And I think that's what you and I are both working on. What are those questions? And then ideally, we also show them examples of where they've been answered well, like your example from Clean
Water Services.
Yeah, Clean Water Services. You know, where they actually ended up creating this huge, much more benefit than $10 million would probably buy just on its own. Even if it was just a $10 million equipment fix, they ended up creating so much more value for the community. And that, I think, is ask those big questions and get people thinking along these lines, and then point out tools that are out there like what you've created.
Yeah. And that's what I really like, how Seattle Public Utilities has sort of institutionalized that and enable those kind of questions to be asked, and enable a process that brings in people with different perspectives that might have kind of out-of-the-box ideas, and provide a formal setting for those to be brought into consideration and evaluated. And I think smaller communities, SPU has incredible capacity compared to a lot of the communities in our region. So I think there's a role for the state to help smaller communities
that you consider. You might still end up with what you would have done anyway, but every time you're making an infrastructure investment, if you're thinking more broadly, 10 to 25% of the time, you're going to pick at something that you wouldn't have done otherwise. And that 10 to 25% of the time, you're going to be creating more value for the community than they would have had otherwise. And if that happens every year, year after year after year, you're just building compounding interest, compounding value. And so it's really a huge opportunity to shift the way that we spend money every year to maintain, operate, expand our infrastructure systems. It's a huge opportunity to remake our communities, to make them more resilient and meet all our other social and cultural goals at the same time.
So Steve, if you were at Seattle Public Utilities when this was first instituted, I'm curious what resistance or how much people embraced it at the beginning. Planners often feel that it's the engineers that are siloed, and also feel that the engineers don't value the planner's perspective. So how did you bridge that gap? Or was it baby steps along the way, or some visionary leader that made it happen? Or?
Well, it was a little bit of both. Seattle Public Utilities, one of the things that's unique about Seattle Public Utilities is that it's a multidisciplinary utility. So the original idea of the mayor of Seattle back in the Norm Rice days, for those who can remember that or know that, he was the one that said, we're going to take the water department, the drainage department, the engineering department, and we're going to put them all into one utility and solid waste. And so there was, I happened to work for the water department at the time. So as we came together, there was, the silos were, real. And there was also a sense of loss. People that had, committed to their own, the drainage folks were suddenly now being engulfed by the water department. Water and drainage, we don't drink our sewage water, we don't, anyway, so there was plenty of reason to be skeptical, but the vision that the mayor and his staff had at the time was, we can create a more efficient department, and we can deliver a broader range of services better. And it wasn't just to save money, but it was also a recognition of the environmental benefit that comes from thinking of it. But once you get into the trenches and you're the staff folks, besides union issues, there's also concerns that that you're losing autonomy. And so there was the normal kinds of resistance that comes from that. What Seattle did, I thought that was particularly useful though, was they said, okay, asset management makes sense. It was an emerging topic globally, at least for water utilities at the time. And Australia utility to be benchmarked against them. So they had, 11 water utilities that benchmarked against each other around asset management, and then Seattle and then King County. So we ended up with two for about 3 years.
Wow.
And then he guided the creation of this entity and then helped train people in all the pieces of how you do it. Years old, it's been 51 years, let's take them up. There's that version of asset management, which is not particularly advanced. The next version is, well, which ones of those pipes are going to break? Which ones really matter? Maybe it's quicker just to fix them when they do break than to replace them all. And so this more sophisticated version was what we got from Australia. And as people got trained, Seattle went from the initial version to the much more advanced version. And then I have to give Chuck Clark, who was a director, second director in, a lot of credit, and he did a really nice job of convening this oversight group that basically said, if we don't see that you really looked at 3 broad alternatives, we're going to give you the project back, and you don't get funding until you, the project team, actually think more about it. So there was a bit of a hammer, and Seattle saved something like somewhere between $70 and $150 million in the first 2 years of visa, because the decisions were much more robust, and and it continues to pay dividends.
And it's been institutional, because no Rhys is several administrations back,
That's
so
right.
this is carried on.
Yeah, in fact, it expanded from the water utility now. Pretty much every capital department, Seattle Parks Department, Transportation, even fleets and facilities, they all, City Light, they all have their own asset management programs. And they do, I don't know how much, but they do some collaboration with others.
Great. We're going to move to questions from the audience in just a minute so be thinking about your questions. And before slide, there we go. We launched a program we called 10 Big Ideas. This initiative was intended, first of all, to make a difference, make change happen. I wouldn't say we exactly got to that point, but what we were able to accomplish was to develop a lot of resource materials for planners in dealing with some of these emerging issues that you see listed on the screen. 2 of those 10 being addressing climate change and rebuilding infrastructure. So I want to tell you first on the climate change, next slide. We had a task force working on this issue for about a year, and over the course of that year, we developed 17 discussion briefs that were roughly grouped into 3 categories: planning approaches for resilience, strategies for planning resilient communities, and preparing for climate resilient events. Basically, we were dealing with ideas of adaptation, mitigation, and response to, or pre-response preparation for climate impacts. All of those resources are found on our chapter website, which is listed up there. The other thing we did was a short video. It's like 9 minutes long. We did a series of these, actually 7, but one of them specific to climate change. And those are intended to be discussion starters, conversation starters. So planners might show them to their city council or their mayor or in a public meeting, just to get some ideas on the table. They talk about what other cities are doing. There's always a little competition between your city and the other cities. So it gives you some examples of that and get some ideas rolling to be a conversation starter. So there's one on climate change that I was involved in, so I think it's great. You can check it out at that website link there, listed there. And then we also dealt with rebuilding infrastructure. Next slide on that. And for that one, we did a toolkit, which both of these guys were involved in, on sustainable infrastructure, a toolkit for planners. And that incorporates some of the principles. Oh, okay, we lost our screen, so he's working on it. That incorporates some of the principles that Rhys has talked about in his description earlier. so you can see that at the link that will be on the screen in a moment when we get that fixed. And then secondly, we had two videos related to infrastructure. One was on green stormwater systems, and the other was building a local workforce with capital investments. And this one talks about creating workforce agreements and how you can build your local workforce and also do it in a more equitable way in your infrastructure projects. So both of those videos are available online. And now we're in a stage, so we should be on the screen called Get Involved. And now we're on a stage of sharing success stories. So we're profiling both in our state newsletter and in a newsletter that's produced by the Municipal Resources Service Center, MRSC, sharing success stories of what people are doing. We've heard some great success stories from these guys. But particularly on climate change, we're looking at for planning and adaptation to climate change. So if you have a story from your community that you think is a good one, or even that things didn't work out so well, but there's some challenges that other people might face, get in touch with me. My email is up there on the screen. So finally, next slide, I want to thank our speakers today. It's been terrific and really great to work with throughout this process. All of our emails are up there on the screen, and I didn't warn you ahead of time, but I'm inviting people to ask you questions via email. So hopefully we'll get some and have some follow-up that way. So at this point, we have about 15 minutes open in our hour-long session, and we're open to take questions from the audience if you have some queued up. If not, then I'll toss out a few questions for our guys.
Participants in the room, and I'll be happy to forward them along.
Okay. In the meantime, I'll ask Rhys, did we get both of your links to your...
Okay.
I think the last slide.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did we miss?
I have a couple there.
There we go. Your two reports, you want to talk about those and then what you're doing next with the Center for Sustainable Infrastructure?
Yeah, I mentioned the first report, Infrastructure Crisis Sustainable Solutions, looks at transportation, the future of transportation, energy, water, waste management, infrastructure systems across the board. And it's based on interviews with 70 thought leaders and innovators from Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, and sort of distills their insights and maps the path toward smarter, transformative infrastructure investment strategies going forward. The new report is called Rewiring the Northwest Energy Infrastructure, and it too is based on interviewing some of the leading visionaries in our region in energy infrastructure. And it's a fascinating time. There are technological and market changes, forces that are transforming this sector that's been pretty stable for 100 years. We've had, basically the model of large centralized power plants sending power out through high voltage transmission lines to distribution lines and out to millions of homes and businesses who are basically passive consumers of electricity. And now that's shifting to where the customers are becoming value producers. They're able to cost effectively actually save and make money by producing energy, by reducing energy, and by managing energy, storing it, and flexing their demand in ways that deliver value to the larger system. It's super exciting. It advances sustainability, opens up potential for a more resilient energy system, but it's also very disruptive, potentially, to the utility business model that's prevailed over the last 100 years. And so managing that change in a way that we don't starve and undermine our utilities, which are a great force for equity, I think, a great social innovation of the 20th century that needs to be sort of brought into the 21st century. But but it's a challenging time in that sense. An incredibly exciting time of change, also very challenging for our utility institutions, a time of change for them. So this looks at integrated approach to our energy infrastructure, electricity, transportation, which is undergoing its own kind of radical changes in the coming decade or two as we move heavily toward electricity power, and to driverless cars and all sorts of cars on demand sort of technologies. And then heating and cooling, which is sort of the hidden part of our energy system. It's about 40% by some estimates of the energy consumption pie, and yet we don't really systematically plan for it and look for it in the way that we do with our electricity infrastructure. So those are some of the highlights.
Sounds great. So both those available on the screen. We have a question now online.
Sure. James asked, with the move away from risk stationary decisions on multi-decade projects, do you see the future model being for infrastructure to be allowed to fail, but to be restored faster? And he has a follow-up that I could ask again. Have either of you worked with a utility-based internet service provider as part of the decompartmentalization of utility silos? Can that department contribute to other departments as well?
Well, on
Big question.
yeah, on the first question, basically, what if you can just fix it faster? If you let it run to failure and then fix it faster, which I think is a short version of that question. And that's definitely one of the alternatives that you would look at. In fact, it may make sense more often than we think. One of the things that the Australian utilities did in order to test these ideas was they would go to a community and they would say, on average right now, your water supply service breaks about 4 hours every 15 years. And are you pretty happy with your water supply service? I said, yeah. Okay, well, we're going to have to spend money to upgrade the system. It's getting old. What if it broke once every 10 years for 4 hours? Would that be okay? I'm like, well, sure. Okay, what if it broke 4 hours every year? No. Okay. We're going to invest at a level somewhere between, where you know it's okay and where you know it isn't. And only if that's cost effective. So it's a way for the customers to tell the utility how much to spend to fix the system. And so in some cases, the utility might go, we can fix it actually in 1 hour. So what if it was 1 hour every 5 years? And so then you would, if that's the solution, then you would compare, what does it cost to have a crew available to fix these little breaks within 1 hour, compared to pulling up all these pipes and putting them all back in. And once you do that math, then you start finding that sometimes rapid repair is the preferred solution. But if it's a critical piece of infrastructure, like for a hospital or something where it just absolutely can never go down, then you spend the money that it takes to harden that as much as possible. But there was another survey that Perth, Australia did to their clients, and they said first they did the survey to their staff, and then they did one to their customers. And they said to the staff, "What do you think our customers want from us?" And they said they want reliable service that never breaks, that's low cost. And they went to the community and they said, "What do you want from us?" And they said, "We want you to help us be climate neutral and have good customer relations." And it was not the same thing. And so the leader of Perth said to the engineers, we're providing services that our customers aren't asking for, and we're not providing services that they want. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, but let's see how we can get better at meeting that. So I guess in both cases, the point is, if we think more broadly about alternatives and ways to create value, not only in the silo, but more broadly for our customers or our communities, sometimes it's going to be fixing it quicker, sometimes it's going to be making sure it never breaks, and you never know until you actually look and compare those alternatives to each other. On the internet provider thing, I don't know anything.
I would just say that to that, a lot of the executives and decision makers in our utilities and infrastructure agencies are my age and older. They watched Get Smart growing up, and they are maybe not the best people to, I'll speak for myself, I wouldn't be the best person to comprehend the capabilities of advanced technology, but younger people coming into this field, I think, are going to be able to see these capabilities much more clearly. Should be working closely and integrating with the infrastructure agencies. Ideally, if you've got data collection, sensors, monitors, collecting streams of data, you could be collecting data that's relevant to the electric grid, that's relevant to the water system, wastewater systems, multiple infrastructure systems, and sharing that across silos. And so the IT department can become sort of a hub for distribution of valuable information that can save money across and increase resilience across silos.
Yeah, certainly there's, Google's talking about building their own city so that they can actually make the infrastructure be the smart system that they imagine that they could make it be. And Cisco's, done a number of projects around the world where they kind of go in and they wire the whole community to be very smart and intelligent. So that's definitely, just like semi-autonomous cars are going to change the way we design roads, the way that we design our infrastructure is changing because of this technology. The hard part for in many of the water and energy utilities is that you've got to go not house by house, but community by community. There's no national energy strategy. There's no national water strategy where you make a national change and then it goes everywhere. So the barriers to entry are very high for these new technologies, but that doesn't mean that they won't be working their way
in a sense of interoperability or just standards so that things are plug and play?
Yeah, well, yeah, if you can get one community to buy into your really smart system that leads to incredible energy efficiency or water efficiency or whatever, you then got to go drive down the road 20 miles to the next community and talk them into it as well. Whereas if you can go to Singapore or some more centrally organized government and talk them into it, then it flows throughout. And the U.S. is famously disaggregated in our infrastructure, utility, water in particular, and that disaggregation then makes for a higher barrier to getting adoption of innovation. That just means that it's not easy, but I think it also means it is inevitable. It's just going to take longer because of the resistance. If you think about that curve, it's like it's up at that top, there's a lot of resistance to change. But at some point, change will happen either because the costs shift or because something collapses and you need to rebuild quickly.
Mon, do we have other questions?
Yes, Gavin wrote, first, thank you for your time and for sharing your realizing that stationarity is dead. It seems like building a better business case is more difficult for investing in infrastructure projects. What tools do institutions use now in replacement of a risk-based approach in building a business case?
So in the business case, what it basically, we sketched out an outline for in Boulder County situation, Boulder collaborative situation. What the business case does is it helps you look at what values would benefit or they might be qualitative. Like, this is just going to look better. Or we think it'll improve real estate values, but we don't know if it's at $1 or $1,000, but because it looks better, it will increase real estate value. So then when you're the decision maker deciding which of these alternatives you're going to look at, you might have two projects that pretty much perform pretty close on the price, but one of them has these extra values that's either more resilient and adaptable, or it helps with community economics. And if community economics is better, that's more resilient as well because they have more capacity to handle interruption. So the business case just provides a framework for kind of doing an apples-to-apples comparison between the two. One of the things that happens is we're not throwing out risk-based because many requirements and rules are based on that risk-based approach. So one community, many actually, will say, we build all of our roads to the 100-year storm. So that's the baseline. And the 100-year storm is calculated by looking back. And that's not appropriate for the future. But it's still a baseline. So what we said was you've got to meet whatever the minimums are. But there are some cases where you want to go far beyond that because you've done this prioritization of what kind of performance you want. So it's a transition from the 100-year storm to the performance that we're seeking. And in that transition, you know, again, 10 to 15 to 25% of the time we'll end up with a better result. Many times we'll just end up with what we would have, but we'll have thought more broadly. And just that rigor to the process really helps. And then the way you implement it is that you just basically get the budget authority in the community to say, we want projects to go through this method, and we're going to review the business cases before anything gets funding. Everybody has fair warning. It's not at the last second. You just then suddenly everything goes through this broader rigor, and then we end up getting better solutions that are more adaptable over time.
And save money. In this case,
Well, sometimes you do save money. It's not always true that the more resilient or adaptable solution costs more. In fact, we have found sometimes it's even way less expensive. And part of it is by getting out of the silo thinking, and well, we've done it this way, now we're doing it that way. By bringing together integrated teams from multiple silos, kind of, and the encouragement that our checklist gives them to think, you know, think about it in different ways. You end up kind of suddenly going, well, you know, that actually could work if we did this. And then that ends up being, can be a huge cost saving. But mostly what we tell folks is what you want is the same or better levels of service, single level levels of service for the same or less cost. And if you can get the same cost, but it's got more value to the community, then you want that one. If it's less cost, then that's great as well. But if it's less cost, but it's worse for the community, then that's not what you want. Resilience into the process. So it's something that engineers can be very comfortable with, because when the RFP is written for the next job, or was they're writing, asking someone to design something for them, they're going to say, we want you to design us the system that meets our minimum standards and is the most adaptable and flexible and gives us this kind of performance in this area. And then when you have your design teams going after that job and they know that's the job, then they'll assemble themselves that way and they'll do a great job meeting that for you. So we need as much the community leaders and infrastructure owners to ask for this as for them, for the providers to provide it, and we need both. So there's a transaction that's emerging. Boulder County Collaborative is one start on that, and there's others that's one.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, well, I think we are right at our hour. And so we're going to conclude the formal presentation. But if you were interested to find out more about the Masters of Infrastructure Planning and Management, stay on the line and we'll take another 5 minutes or so just to tell you a little bit more about that program. We are in the cycle of receiving applications